All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming today. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for allowing us to do this. And I thank you that you give me the opportunity to teach this, Father. It's just the greatest blessing that it could ever happen to me, Father, is being able to share your word with people. Father, please help us to understand what you want us to see. And we just commit this to you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to be going through starting Judges and Kings. Now, two things have happened. First, this class is going a lot longer than I thought it would. So I didn't think we were going to go there. We're actually going to take an extra 4 weeks in this class and end at the end of January. But the good news is I also found out that Jeff gave me the opportunity that I'm going to be able to teach a Christian history class next year. Now, that will be fun, and don't think just because it's history it's going to be boring. I promise you, we will put a lot of stuff into that, and it'll help you to see all kinds of things and help you understand things. And I tell you, you will love it, because to understand and to cherish our faith, it's a good thing to go through. So let's go into this. I've got a mic to turn on first. Okay, on. Okay, a trip through history, and yes, we've got to have SpongeBob, and you'll understand this in a minute, because once we get SpongeBob on there, you can always hear the guy. I don't know if you've ever seen SpongeBob, you hear him say, 2 hours later, that with the French accent. Yeah, well, trust me, you're going to see what I mean by that in just a minute with the French accent. So we're going to go through history today, because the thing about this, when you look at the Judges and Kings, unlike the law, Judges and Kings is just a lot of history. And it's not always a lot of very good history. It's a lot of very hardcore history, and it's sometimes hard to understand. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through a few things in history first to help you guys get an understanding of what we're talking about through them. History has a way of taking many twists and turns. That's very interesting, because we're going to go through, like, for instance, if you're going through Judges and you're reading, or going through Kings you're reading, and all of a sudden you read that the book of the law was discovered 70 years later, and that's true. It's in Chronicles talks about that they lost the book of the law for 70 years. That's a lot of twists and turns. However, in 1789, a process started that would shake Europe to the core. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light. It was a season of darkness. Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, if you've ever read that. And if you know what he's talking about, and you can see by this famous painting here, the success of the American Revolution, France decided to take a crack at their own revolution. Benjamin Franklin, this is important because when we go a little bit later today, you're going to talk about the founding fathers and stuff. He's part of that. So Benjamin Franklin had a big role in this. In the French Revolution, this guy, Maximilien Robespierre, helped lead the way and instrumental in the death of King Louis, and the Marie Antoinette. You probably heard about those guys. He also had 20,000 people executed. Nice guy. And with the famous words, "F with their heads." You've probably heard that. Okay, well, and so we have Marie Antoinette, the Robespierre there. However, that's not important. Now, when I thought about that, I thought about the Airplane movie. Doctors, what is it? It's a large building with doctors. But that's not important. Yeah, anyway. So that's not important. So what's important is what they did. They made Christianity illegal. 1789, way back in the day, before Darwin, before science, before everybody hated God, everything else, right? This was a Christian nation. They literally, in this French Revolution, made Christianity illegal. They outlawed it. The church of the day was very rich and tied to the monarchy. So they made it illegal, and they took the land the churches had and closed all the churches. I mean, just think about it. One day you're going to church, next Sunday you can't get into the church. And by the way, the preacher, pastor, whatever, they were all taken away. They were sent to jail. Those who confirmed to be the new state religion could keep their job. So basically, if you turn to the new state religion, you can keep your job. If not, you're going away. That new religion was worshiping the earth. I know some of you guys, I can see you guys are shocked by this. It's true. For a whole year, France worshipped the earth. They called it Earth Day. This was before 1970s doing it in America. This was hundreds of years before that. It was held outside, and they were called to celebrate Mother Earth. If you did not do that, you would lose your job and mostly your head in the process. Okay? History is a way of changing things. Within a day, these guys went to that. The next twist in this tale is who would bring Christianity back. But by the way, that's actually a picture from that. It was called that La Constitution Civile du Creuset. I have terrible French. But after the dissolution of the church, okay, notice the balls in the picture there depicting the earth, the shining of the earth. That's a picture from there. And I'm going to tell you something. I actually had a hard time finding anything about this because France does not like to admit that this happened. They said it was just a very big mistake, they called it. A big mistake. They closed the churches down and they basically took everybody away and said, you're going to start worshiping the earth? I don't think that's a mistake. But who brought it? Who do you think brought it back? And now think to yourself, what's the one person in the world you probably would never thought would have brought this back? Well, if you know, then you know it's this guy. Yes, you all know, I can see by your faces, you know who Napoleon Bonaparte is. So not only was the church closed down for a year, Napoleon brought it back. Napoleon brought it back. Of all the people, you're like, Napoleon Bonaparte? Yes, he's the one who brought it back. What happened was, although not a strong Christian, he realized to help mold and have them follow him into war, religion was needed. Now, I'll tell you, that's actually an interesting thing because if you ever study Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto, that's one of the statements from Marx and Engels, that religion was needed for a time. So yes, this guy got rid of it. So, as you can see, as a way of taking unexpected turns. How'd you like to be a Christian back then, and all of a sudden your church is closed down, you're going to start, oh, by the way, there's the earth, here's the sun, guess what you're going to be worshiping? Not the Son of God, but the Son. So, these are the favorite verses of historians. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything in which you can say, look, this is something new? It was already here long ago. It was here before our time. However, I wrote that however is mine. Solomon didn't write whoever in there, but I did that. However, no one remembers the former generations. Even yet those to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. In Ecclesiastes. Solomon was very smart. He made some bad decisions later in life, but he was very smart. Because the thing is, we have to understand that everything we look in history, when we read the Bible, the Old Testament, we read through all those kings and the judges and all those guys, we have to understand that those guys are no different than the guys today. They're no different than the people from the 1950s, from the 1850s, from the 1650s. People remain the same. And if you understand that, it will really help you to understand that when we read the Bible, the Old Testament is a blessing because God can show us 900 years of history of how people did it, of how they made mistakes, of how they turned this way or turned that way, and we can learn from those mistakes. That's the blessing about history. So, what does it mean to be a godly nation? And is America a godly nation? Now, before we go into this, I want to say I'm a Gulf War veteran. Okay, I'm from the Navy. I was a Gulf War veteran. I love America very much. But we have to be kind of realistic when we look at some of this stuff. So, Do our leaders make us godly? Do those who over us make us a godly nation? How many presidents were actually active Christians? Out of 46 presidents, that they are active Christians, meaning they every day pulled their Bible out, they prayed, and actively read the Bible. How many guys think? 20? 15? 30? Pardon me? 6 or 7? I wish it was that many. 3 out of 46 presidents, only 3. Jimmy Carter, James Garfield, and William McKinley. Those are the guys who actually, and one of those guys, I don't remember which one. I know Carter was, but I think it was McKinley who was Church of Christ, actually. I think Garfield's Church of Christ. Thank you. Very good. Okay, there you go. So, one of those guys. So, only 3 of them. So 3 of our presidents were actually active out of 46. The early church fathers of our country were very religious, were they not? No. In some ways, they were worse than those who followed them. And again, I'm not saying bad things about our country. I love this country. But the reality is we have to understand that it's not always the way we see things. Thomas Jefferson was called an atheist. He rejected the virgin birth, called the book of Revelation ravings of a maniac, and described the Trinity as hocus pocus phantasm. That's our second president. Third. Thank you. Who was the second? Oh, Adams. That's Adams. Thank you. I took history. I took American history in college, and I should remember that. Thank you so much. All right, so that's our third president. Deism, that was what they did. They worshiped deism. Now, interesting, think of this, what we just talked about, France in 1789, and think of what this is here. It's a religion of nature. Was a form of rational theology that emerged among free-thinking Europeans in the 17th and 18th centuries. Instead of that, religious truth should be subject to authority of human reason rather than divine revelation. And I added this in because it sounds like what 2 Timothy 3:5 says, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Now, they all went to church. But there was quite a few of them were deists. And again, we just looked at what happened with deists in France. Thomas Jefferson became a deist. Washington was a deist. Madison, Monroe, Tyler, they were all identified as having some degree of deistic beliefs. So, and again, I'm not trying to put our country down, but the reality is our leaders are not what makes us this. And the reason why I'm putting this in here is because when we go and look at the kings, history is repeating itself. The kings, there were only a few kings who were really dedicated to God. Probably less than 5 who were very dedicated to him. Okay? Yes, ma'am?
The things I read about Reagan, I he was a religious, he considered himself a Christian.
Reagan, again, the problem with, and Reagan and Bush Sr. and those guys, they hung out with a lot of religious people. But none of them actually were very much, they didn't come forth and read their Bible every day and spend time with God and everything. So, but they I don't know. I'm sure maybe they did some praying. I don't know. But all I know is when I did the study of all of this, they actually took a study of every single president, what they believed, what they did, how they did it, everything else, and they really only came up with 3 who were actively. So, and again, the sad thing about politicians, you never really know the whole truth with those guys, unfortunately. So, yeah. And so, we have Unitarian presidents. Unitarian, now remember we talked about the Arians, Arian religion where God's here, Jesus Christ is way down here. Like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, those guys that are Arians. Jesus is way down here, like a prophet. Unitarians do not believe in the Trinity. Unitarians believe that there's God and Jesus is way down here somewhere. They're a form of oneness, one branch of Christian theology. There were 4 presidents identified as Unitarians. These are early presidents. Taft, Fillmore, Adams, and Adams were Unitarians. Does church attendance make us a godly nation? Okay, how many people actually come to church? Well, I'll tell you, we look at that. Oh, everybody went to church back then. Well, not necessarily, but they also, maybe they beat up on their wives, they had alcoholism. There's a lot of things involved with this. Church attendance does not necessarily make us that way. In 1800, 1 in 15 people actively went to church. In an early church. Okay? 1 in 15. Now, but it's interesting, this will follow there was a very active revival in the mid-1700s we'll talk about in a second. But the thing is, whenever things get really tough, think of 9/11. Everybody and his brother flocked to church. I remember Desert Storm. I'll never forget this picture I saw when I was in the service during Desert Storm. They had the GIs, they had this, in the middle of the desert, they formed this big old this thing of water, they put all this water, and they had this line going for miles. This is a thing from the newspaper, for miles of GIs wanting to get baptized. They had just lines of them. When things get tough, that's what happens. But this is after the American Revolution. Things started going good, things started getting better. People started going, I don't really need to go back to church anymore. So 1 in 15. In 1906, 37% of Americans went to church. Okay, and what I did is I took it from the census of 1906, and the census also looked at religious affiliation, and only 30 out of 32 million people, out of 84, went to church. Let's talk about the Great Awakening. Oh, sorry, the S should be up there, not S in America. Sorry about that. Yeah, pardon me? That's right, the Great Awakening of Sin in America. But notice the space between sin. With sin. It's bad. It's really bad stuff. Ooh. So, actually, my favorite thing when I was taking guitar lessons when I was a kid. I was playing guitar, and some of you guys know I'm a big guitar player. And so my friend said, "Okay, so what's the difference in the major and the minor scales?" Well, the major is the happy scale. The minor scale is the evil scale. Black Sabbath, evil scale. He always said that. I always thought that was interesting. Never forgot it. I always remember that. But the Great Awakenings. Now, these are the times in history. There's actually 3 Great Awakenings they talk about. First Great Awakening was a huge revival in the mid-1700s. Jonathan Edwards in America and George Whitefield in England. Many people came to God during that time. There was a huge influx of Christianity, people coming back to God. But remember, this was also a tough time. There was problems in England, there was problems in America, there was all kinds of problems, and many people during those times tend to come back to God. The second and third Great Awakening occurred during the 1800s with guys like Charles Finney and D.L. Moody. The thing about those guys, again, they found that many people came. Many people came. But as we saw, by the time we get to 1900, they all went, which is sad. In the 1950s, the spiritual awakening began with people like Billy Sunday and Billy Graham. Now, some people don't like Billy Graham and stuff, but one of the things that Billy Graham, that I was involved with some of the stuff there, because the thing about the Billy Graham ministries, all he was a planter. The churches were supposed to water. The churches were supposed to come in, take the people with them, and water them. So Billy Graham did his job very well. The church is supposed to come in and do that. But the thing is, in the 1950s, there was a huge spiritual awakening, and they actually found that more than 60% of the Americans went to church during this time. It was a huge awakening. But unfortunately, then the 60s came, and everything kind of went out.
John, during that period of time, if we look at history, we
You hit it right on the dot. Immigration was one of the biggest reasons why. Yes, that's one of the biggest reasons why. Yes, you're very true. Very true. So, good job. That's exactly why. And that's actually what they said in this literature, was that during the immigration time, there was a lot of people were just not able to go and stuff like that. So, but but another thing, by the time you get to the 1900s, there was the 1890 depression that went through, and people came back, and then everything started going good again in 1900s. And then we had things started going good, so people kind of left. 1920s hit, and more people left because they were celebrating and stuff like that. And then the 1930s hit, and depression, and people started coming back again. So, but there is a reason why we're going through this. So please bear with me. James 1:14. So basically, how does a country decline into sin? Each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then after desire was conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. And that's the thing, is that why do people come in? Where do they go out? Because that's just the way people are. And that's the thing is, one of the hardest things to do with each other is to deal with each other, live with each other, work with each other, because the thing is, we have sin inside of us. So let's talk about the Judges. And the Judges. Now, the Judges is actually a very interesting book. And we're not going to go into that much information on the Judges. This is going to be kind of a short lecture today, but the Judges, we're not going to go into that, but I highly recommend you reading it because it's a shocker. This book is not the kind of, this is almost a rated R book sometimes because there's some really bad stuff that happens. But really, the sad part, what happened was that for all God did for them, after all that God did and blessed them and everything else, once they got into the land, they kind of went away. And I always think about this because I was in the Navy, so I remember, so it's kind of like a port of call. Sailors come into like the Philippines or something like that, they get off the ship and woohoo! And just, and that's kind of what happened, is they immediately turned away no matter what God did. But that's the reason why I wanted to show you America. Because I wanted to help you guys to understand that they weren't the only ones to do that. Because it's very easy to read this and look at them and say, what's you guys' problem? Because I was shocked when I first read this. And I was praying, said, God, how do I just present this when these people like immediately got in here and they went? But then God started saying, help me to remember all these things in America and everything else, and come to realize that history repeats itself. Just like in America, just like in Europe, just like in many places, everything starts getting better and everything. They get in, and we're like, okay. All right. So prior to Israel having kings, they were led God-appointed judges. Now, it's interesting. This is the key point here. God appointed the judges, every single one of them. They didn't just raise up out of nowhere. God appointed them specifically. These came from a variety of sources, usually military, which is very normal. Most of the people that come through there are usually, the leaders are usually military, and from a variety of tribes. So they didn't just come from this one tribe, they came from a variety of them. The time of Judges lasted around between 300 and 350 years. So understand that, just kind of like, think about it being like America. So in the 1600s we get here, 350 years later would be 1950. And that's a long time, but these guys did not have a king for the first 350 years. They never had a king. Okay? They never had a leadership over them, for the most part. And only when God raised the judges up did they actually have someone over them. So it began with Othniel and ended with Samuel. So Samuel is the last judge. Okay? Samuel is the last judge. Now, I did not say that the last two judges, Eli and Samuel, were actually priests. but most everybody else before that were usually military in some sense. Okay, 3 problems found in Judges. Number 1, starting with the first generation, they turned away from God, as we see in Judges 2, 10 through 14. Let me read that. After the whole generation had been gathered their ancestors, they all died. That's easy to say, they died. Another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done in Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. Does anybody remember what Baal stands for? Lord? So whenever we say Baal means Lord, like Baal Zebub, Lord of the Flies. So Baal means Lord. If you remember the polytheism. And also, if you guys need a refresher, you guys can always go back on YouTube in the polytheism lecture, because that will go into some of this. They served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. Which, remember what Ashtoreths were? The Ashtoreth poles. Yeah, that was somewhat of a Canaanite, more of an Assyrian deity, and it was a female. So remember, though, the Ashtoreth was the female and Baal was the male. So they did together. So in the anger against Israel, the Lord gave them in the hands of the raiders who plundered them. And this is a common theme over and over and over. They turned away from God. They did their own thing. Raiders would come in and take over. And they called out to the Lord. And that's why we're not going to go, because it just happens over and over and over again in Judges. So he sold them into the hands of the enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Now, that's interesting. They are no longer able to resist. Remember when they came in and took out Jericho? They were able to resist them quite well. But again, once they started turning away from God, they doing their own thing, whatever they're doing, they just basically went off and did their own thing. And so consequently, that's what happens. And sadly, that is actually what happens in most countries before they fall, is that everybody's all doing their own thing, serving their own thing. It's all about me and everything else. Then the country becomes weakened and weakened and weakened, and then enemies are able to come in and take them out. And that's exactly what happened. So that's the first problem in Judges. Problem number 2. They did not completely drive out the people living among them as God told them to do. So God said, get rid of all the people. And the reason why, because they're going to cause you to stumble. We looked at that when we went through the law. And Judges chapter 1 kind of says that. As God said in the law to drive out all the people so they would not be a snare to Israel. In Deuteronomy 7:16, you must destroy all people the Lord your God gives over to you. Do not look on them with pity and do not serve their gods, for they will be a snare to you. Now, I'm going to tell you, I didn't put this in here, but we have a few minutes, so let me go over it real quick. Right before they went into the land, it's in Numbers, what happened was that Midian, which is, so here's Israel, here's Moab, and Midian is over here. Midian and Moab kind of got together and said, hey, let's get their God mad at them. So what they did is they actually had raised up all these females in those guys, sent them over to entice the Israelites, and the guys just like on a Navy ship said, woohoo, females, yeah, and zoom. And so what they did was these females not only went, whatever, they did what they did, they also took them and had them start worshiping their gods. Now remember what we talked about in the polytheism lecture? What is the one major thing about most of these Canaanite religions? There was always a sexual component to it. And you find with a lot of your really hardcore religions and stuff, there's a sexual component a lot of times. I'm not talking about like Muslim stuff. I'm talking some of these other guys. There's always a sexual component to it because it entices people to come into it. And so what Midian and Moab did is they sent these ladies in there, and the guys went away. And then all of a sudden, they start bringing their new girlfriends into the camp. Hey, look what I got here. Yeah, God was not very happy with that. So we find that that's the reason why. I mean, this was even before they went into the land they happened to them. Okay, in the end of Numbers, it happened to them. So the thing is, it is very true that they will turn them away. And sadly, what they did not do is did not drive them out. All right, number 3. They did not have a good relationship with each other. Herein lies one of the biggest problems in the world at large. We don't get along with other people. But these guys they did everything together. They were brothers. They all related to one another, so they would all go in there, and hopefully they would all get along. That's not what happened. They continually fought with each other, which would bring about the splitting of the nation in the time of the kings. When we get to kings, that's going to be a big problem. They're going to actually split. And because of that, that's the reason why they're going to fail. This is a problem with man from the beginning. Christians could learn to use from this historical problem. We don't get along with other Christians. Now, I was thinking about this week. You know, the guy who went up into Colorado Springs and shot up that LGBTQRSTUVWXYZ, whatever those letters are, nightclub. I don't know if he was saying he's a Christian or not, but if you have too many of those happen, who do you think they're going to point the finger at? Christians. Who are the only people that are really standing up against that? So one day we may actually have to get along with our brothers, other Christian brothers from the church down the street or wherever, so that we can fight against this. Not fight, but stand against this. So that was a big problem in Judges. They didn't get along with each other. That's going to be a problem in Kings, in Chronicles. That's going to cause them to fall. All of the major problems that's going to come in together collectively is really going to settle on that one big point, that they didn't get along. And that they didn't drive out the other nations. So here's the biggest problem. Moses told them, you are not to do as you do here today, everyone doing as they see fit. Or other versions say, do not do what is right in their own eyes. So here's what they did. They didn't have a king over them, they said. They didn't have guys over them. So what they did was they basically just did whatever they thought was right. But wait a minute. Didn't we spent 3 weeks on the law. And what were they supposed to do with the law? Read it. Tell them about it. They are supposed to have tassels put on their garments. They're actually supposed to let their hair grow longer here. Truly, that is one of the reasons why. If you ever see Hasidic Jews, their hair is longer here. They're supposed to grow longer here to help remind them of the law. They were supposed to do all these things to remind them, but unfortunately, what they really did was that. That's what they did. In those days, Israel had no king in Judges. It says, everyone did as they saw fit. It is apparent as you go through Judges that this was the problem. And again, when you read Judges, it's almost a rated R, because it's not a good, there's a lot of really tough stuff in there. And it's really hard, especially after we spent so much time on how wonderful the law was. The law was great. God told him everything, helped him to do all these things, and said, just read it and follow it, everything will be good. But sadly, that's not what happened. But it does sound like today. Everybody does what they see fit. See, the key is, guys, is there's consequences for everything. Every choice that we make, there's a consequence, whether good or bad. If we choose to do God's way, the reason, for a long time, I was like, God is like, he tells you, don't do this, don't do that. Oh, that's boring. I want to do what I want to do. But I come to realize especially after going and studying the law so much, is that God says, if you do what I tell you, things will go well with you. Boy, I found that to be very true. And I started saying, well, I think I really do want to do that, because you know what? He promises things will go well with me if I do. It's not that I'm just going to have tons of money fall on me and all this other stuff. No, it's not that at all. But if you obey him and do what he wants you to do, things will go well. And that's the exact problem that they had here. They said, oh, I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. So let's see about the consequences. So there are consequences for all of our actions. Doing what is right in our own eyes always ends in disaster. It ends in disaster. You know, one of the problems with today is that we tell people, hey, it's okay. If you're a girl, you want to be a guy, you could do whatever you want. Well, there's a big problem with that. I teach anatomy and physiology. So one of the things I teach is that guys have an Y chromosome, girls do not. So no matter what you're telling someone, a girl can never become a guy. It's impossible. It's literally impossible because they have that chromosome. So we're telling everybody, hey, it's okay to do whatever you want and be confused or whatever else, and you go, okay. But the problem is there's consequences for everything. And in the Judges, that's what it was. This is what happened to the people in Judges and would need strong leaders to lead them out. Let's continue with the king starting next week. So next week, what we're going to do is we're going to come and talk about the kings. I'm going to go into just a few different kings, and we're going to just kind of profile them to see what's going on with them, some of the problems. And this is kind of tough because, you know, for a long time, I always thought, well, these guys were Jewish. They loved God. Well, that's not really the truth. But again, then when I looked at American history and other history, I'd come to realize that, well, they're no different than anybody else. Most of your leaders, if you were to look at them, they're really not godly. You know, they have a form of godliness. And one of the things we'll see that the leaders did, and this is something you'll just keep, and I want you to keep in mind when we go into the kings next week, is that they're going to say they're going to tear down the high places, or they're going to tear down the Ashtoreth poles, or they're not going to tear down the high places and not tear down the Ashtoreth poles. That may sound stupid, but what it is they only took care of certain parts of Israel. So when a king came in and didn't tear down the high places, the people were on the edge over here being synchronistic. Remember what synchronism was? Combining two religious beliefs together. They were synchronistic, combining two religious beliefs together. They were synchronistic. And so what happened is that they went in and they said, okay, we're going to serve God, but I'm not going to tear down the high places. So people on the fringe over here are going to be still doing their own thing. Okay? And they would only, so that's what really is going to be the idea. Is the king going to go through and wipe out all the idol worship or just some of it? So, and a lot of times they're going to do a lot of stuff because they think that's what the people want. And it's pretty sad. Is there any questions on this? I know it's a little early, but we have a few minutes left. Is there any questions about the law or anything that we've talked about so far? All right, guys. Thank you so much. We're done. A few minutes early. Woohoo!